Hi, I'm Derrick. I live in London. I'm from the Netherlands. We can have conversation about that later over beer if that is necessary. I work for the PHP Foundation 1 day a week to work on the PHP language itself. But I've been around working on PHP as well as Xdebug for probably 20 years now, if not longer. And this afternoon we're going to have a look at some of PHP's new features. But when I gave a talk about these PHP features from about a year ago, when PHP 8.1 came out, I've noticed that quite a few of these things are sometimes very hard to explain. So I thought it'd be nice to then also show that by going through a debugger, Xdebug in my case. And while doing so, I like to try new things, and I tried using Docker and VS Code and stuff like that. And I found out that lots of people struggle with getting Xdebug and debugging to work sometimes with containers. And so did I when I was then making this workshop. No, not this workshop, but when I was thinking about making this workshop. So it is sort of now turned into a mix between cool new PHP features that we're going to look through with a debugger, but at the same time we make sure that the debugger also gets debugged. And Xdebug over the years has gotten many new features that help you looking at why things go wrong, as well as some additional things that are upcoming in the new version of Xdebug, Xdebug 3.2. Now, that needs some support in IDEs. If you have read my instructions, I've shown you that I'm going to show you this with VS Code and PHP Storm. Show of hands from your side, how many of you are using VS Code? Okay, nobody. Interesting. How many of you are not using PHP Storm? Okay. Well, that cuts down a lot of my presentation. I might be done a bit earlier now. Now, I am still going to show you some of it with VS Code, because I think it's quite a good tool, but it also allows me to show you something that PHP Storm works around, right? And it gives you a bit of a better overview of what happens there. So the idea that I do is I talk a little bit about PHP stuff. We'll have a look at debugging some of the things in there, and at that moment we do a little bit of an exercise. How many of you set up read my instructions and follow them? Okay, 5 out of 100. Okay, yeah, I don't think we're going to have enough time for you to all download a new Docker image, because the Wi-Fi might break over that. We'll see how it goes. If it works, then great. If it doesn't, then you should have done your homework, that's all I have to say. But no worries. I will still do it on my own, so if you can't work along, you can at least read along, that's all. If there's any questions during anything I have to say, please let me know as soon as I can, as you can, because I like having a bit of an interactive session. I've been on planes all day and airports, so my voice is already breaking, even though I've been speaking for only 3 minutes. So that doesn't bode very well. Yes, I'm happy to answer your questions. And I'd say let's give it a go then. So the topics I'm mostly focusing on PHP, because PHP over the last 4 years have had so many new features, I can't really talk about them all, but I can focus on the improvements to PHP type system. So this is something that the PHP development team has been working quite hard on making it much easier for you to write code that you can reason about, and more so that you can more clearly express yourself what a code is supposed to do. Now, some of these things are not necessary. It's already breaking. Some of these things are not necessarily implemented directly into PHP, but additional tools like static analysis tools like Psalm or PHP Stan can make use of some of this functionality without it having done by the PHP engine itself. But most of the things are also enforced by the PHP engine. This sounds all very abstract, and because it is, so I hope to fix that in the next hour and 40 minutes or hour and 45 minutes. All right. So let's start with PHP 8.0. PHP 8.0 adds new type information in the form of union types. Now, union types are something that if you have any sort of code, you probably already had to use at some point in the past, right? I mean, if you have this number class, contrived example, I know. So if you want to store numbers, and numbers in PHP you might be aware of can be both integers without decimal points and floating point numbers with decimal points. But if you want to type any method in PHP or return type, you can't really use int or float because that would exclude the other type. So the way how you could do this before PHP 8.0 is by just adding comments to it, and then IDEs, PHP Storm, and static analysis tools like Psalm and PHP Stan will then inform you if you're having code that doesn't adhere to these comments here. But that's all that they all really are, right? They are just comments, which the PHP engine just ignores. So the engine doesn't enforce the typing here. Now, what PHP 8.0 allows you to do is you can allow to union type. So union types are a way of allowing either multiple types for the properties, for arguments, as well as return types. And PHP will make sure that you actually do these things, and if you don't do them, you'll get a type error. A type error is a form of exception that if you don't catch it, your program will stop, which is of course not a good idea. So these union types are kind of nice. Now, union types were introduced in a bit of a haphazard way to start with. And there were some weird intricacies in PHP's internals already, because some of PHP's internal functions do some kind of weird stuff with returning types. Like if you've ever read the documentation for the microtime function, is this too small on the back, by the way? I can make it a bit bigger. You can read this fine in the back as well. Okay. I should have checked that. Sorry. So the microtime function, what it does, it either returns a string or a floating point number, depending on one of the parameters that you give it. So the parameter to microtime is actually called get as float, and then it will return a floating point number. Those are not great APIs. I mean, I would not suggest that you, with a argument type, change the type of what you're returning from your function. But PHP is an old language. It's been there for, well, how long? 27 years or something now. And at some point, and I sort of vaguely remember this argument being adding to return it as a floating point number instead of a string. So there's other things in there like get time of day. Again, there's an argument. We return either an array or a floating point number. And during PHP 8.0, when the development team started working on the JIT engine, just-in-time compilation for the PHP engine, this engine really could use proper typing for internal functions in PHP, like microtime or get time of day. And to be able to express these types, we had to introduce unit types in the engine already itself. But we also made it sure that you as users of PHP language can also make use of these types. But we did have to introduce some weird things in here. So like the base64 decode function returns either a string or false, which is kind of odd, but that's how PHP traditionally done these things, right? You either get a result or you get false back. However, PHP internally would never do something or true. It would only ever do something or false. So we didn't add true as allowed type, only false, which is a bit odd. Now all these union types can now be expressed in PHP's internal definitions, so the JIT engine could make use of it, but that turned out to be not worth the effort, so it doesn't. So we added sort of union type for internal functions, but it didn't actually end up helping much. But it does give the side effect of you, if you write PHP code, can now make use of these union types as well. So there's a few rules around these union types. You can't use void as part of a union type. If you use question mark class name or interface name, it's the equivalent of class or null. Without the question mark, you can't use null unless you use equals null at the end of your argument, which is, as far as I know, is a syntax choice that Symfony makes. We also added false in addition, but not true. You can't use redundant types. Redundant types meaning, for example, you can't have bool or false because false is a boolean already. Similarly, if you have a class name and a parent class name, also makes no sense to do. And if PHP already knows what a parent class is at that moment, which isn't always the case because most of you will use autoloading for PHP classes and files now. If a class isn't known yet, these checks are not, these checks for redundancy are only checked if PHP already knows about the class names in there. If it doesn't know about it, it will not trigger the autoloader to then load the classes. Which means that in some cases, even though you have redundant types, PHP doesn't warn or error out on it. It does in most of the cases because it isn't very often that, of course, you have parent class or inherit or child class in a union anyway, because it doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm not actually sure whether you would get that warning then at runtime when you're actually trying to pass in things. I have never actually tried that. So the union types also follow standard variant rules, and variant rules is basically a way of making sure that inherited classes adhere to this Liskov substitution principle, or LSP for short. It's a lot easier to pronounce. And that basically means that arguments in inherited classes you can widen, and return types you can shorten or make more narrow. And PHP will check that you do these things correctly, these variant rules. Variant rules are a little bit complicated. I don't think I have any more examples of that in here. The order is irrelevant, so int or string is the same as string or int, whichever you want to use, up to you. And there's also an additionally built-in union type that we added, which makes array or traversable the same as iterable. In PHP 8.2, we switched that around so that iterable is now the same as array of traversable, but you should not notice that anywhere in your own code. Now, how many of you are still using strict types equals 0 in at least some code? Okay, I don't believe that. They're either not paying attention or lying, or both. I know most modern code is being written with strict type equals 1. I understand that, but I don't believe it that none of your code is still, that all of your code is done so far already with that. If that's the case, great. Then we can ignore the slide. Exactly. So it is usually for old code that has this kind of stuff. And that means that type coercion is still being used, right? It's being used. And with union types, because, for example, you can type something as int or string, there's slightly more complicated rules of how things then coerce into the types that are allowed. Now, I will put a slide later online so you can walk through this yourself and figure out why these things happen as they are. But you can basically just believe that PHP does the right thing in this case. That's not always the case with PHP, but in this case, it will do the right thing. Now, we get a few more other things, and my memory gets vague whether these are being introduced in PHP 8.0, 8.1, but I do probably remember if they are being introduced in 8.2, because that's not out yet, of course. So I think this is PHP 8.1 feature, which is read-only ability, or read-only ability, or however you want to say that. Allows you to enforce that properties can be read-only. Now, traditionally, before PHP had this feature, how you would implement read-only properties was usually with a getter. So in this case, we have in our constructor, we define private string name as a property. If you have not seen this construct before, by the inclusion of the word private or public or protected, this actually now defines a property so that you don't have to do that yourself as well. So this code basically expands to private string name as a property definition, and then inside a constructor, it will also do this name equals name. So by having this private keyword in front of string name, it does this boilerplate code so that you don't have to do it yourself, which is kind of nice. It makes like value objects look a lot smaller. And to enforce readability, or read-only ability, yeah, that one, you can mark your properties as private and then use a getter, which then, of course, can return a value because it's not marked as private. So that's how you would originally do this. PHP 8.1 introduces a read-only keyword, which means that you can get rid of your setters altogether. So yes, we we add another keyword now into the constructor here. So we say construct public read-only string name. And then PHP's engine will enforce these things. Now, how does this read-only work? Because a read-only property, if you can only read from it, then how do you store value in it, right? So the word read-only is sort of a lie, because it was really should have said write once. And write once only from the scope it is defined in. So read-only properties can only be initialized once, can only be written a value to once. Usually that happens in your constructor. And it can only be initialized from the scope where it was declared. So you can't do it from an inherited class or anything like that. PHP 8.2 adds the read-only keyword for the whole class, meaning that all the properties that you define are automatically read-only, which is basically what you want for value objects, where you basically have an object representing a bunch of values belonging together. In this case, it is a user with just the name, but it works for all the others as well. So there are a few restrictions to this. It also means that you can't create dynamic properties anymore. Dynamic properties have been deprecated as of PHP 8.2. I have a slide later in a presentation about this at some point. You also can't use the read-only keyword if there's any untyped or static properties. This is a restriction. Untyped properties, for example, if you have a property public name, because they're not typed, you can also not mark them read-only. That was always already the case in PHP 8.1. So this extra read-only keyword on the whole class makes sure that you have no more dynamic properties, and you also can't use the read-only keyword if there are untyped properties. PHP will throw out with a parse error in that case. Now, back to some of the unit types, it's actually gotten more complicated than just a single one. We actually introduced a mixed type that is a union of array or bool or callable or int or basically all of them except for void. The reason why this is there is actually kind of an interesting way, because when you go through some older code and you want to make sure that you add type annotations to all of them, in some cases a function really accepts any type. For example, if you have a collection class, you want to store all kinds of objects or other values in there, it is really accepting all types. So mix distinguishes between, we haven't looked at this code yet, so we don't know what types it can store, and we have looked at this code and we know for certain that it's supposed to store all the types that we give it in a parameter or also as a return value. Yeah, mix is kind of weird. It is there. I have used it very infrequently. It is sort of important to realize that this does not include void, meaning that if you have a method that you define as mixed, if you then inherit a method from this without any types, it doesn't work. Okay, a few more return types. So PHP has this concept for objects. They're either static or self. And that has to do with whether they are inherited or not. Now, in this example, I have an article class and a document class. The document class extends the article class. Static, in this case, means on the class that the function is defined on, whereas self means where the function is called on in which context. So in this case, if I have these two examples here, like article create with title, because create with title is defined on article, it is, sorry, I'm saying this the wrong way around, am I not? My apologies. I even put it on this slide and I still went the other way around. So self is what it is defined on. So if I call it on article create with With article, it's the keyword self. If it is static, it means it is what it is currently defined. So now in this case, it doesn't matter that much because of course we also returning new static, which by definition then means it is returning static, right? Because otherwise it makes no sense. So both of the lines will still work because we're returning new static. But it is a way of distinguishes between defined on and being called on. I've never used this yet. I haven't found a use for it. All right, to get back to this constructed property promotion, I know this goes a little bit, it is a bit tricky because I put in the read-only before constructed property promotion. Is this way of having this set of properties? Well, if you will define them, you also need to sort of set them in your constructor, right? And this is quite a lot of typing for basically no work whatsoever. Now, hopefully, IDE's PHP Storm will probably have a way of creating this boilerplate code for you, but you no longer have to do this now, because you can put this back to something like this, which is a lot more concise. Now, you might also notice that my class name has an emoji in it, which does work in PHP, but I would not recommend you use that. My favorite character to use in class names and function names is the non-breaking space, because it looks like a space, but it still works. Also, don't do that. So usually on my slides, if there's something that is new in there, I have marked them in red. Now the color reproduction on the projector is usually not great, but you can see that the keywords are red. Can you also see that the comma at the end of the last line is turned red? So that's a new feature in PHP 8.1 that allows you to have in your argument lists to methods have a comma in there as well, just like you used to be able to do with arrays. I actually have used that. So this is an example of some code that I've written, but in a smaller form. It's like I have in one of my hobby projects called Dram.io, where I keep notes for all the whiskeys that I taste. I have a search function in there, and for that sometimes I want to have different return types from this first function. So I have the settings class. My real project uses different names, but that doesn't matter. So if I want to return all the objects, including information about the distillery, I can set that to true, or in this case, the default is true. But that gets a bit annoying, right? So if I want to return only the things where I don't want to include the distillery information, but I want to use the description or the tasting notes, I sort of have to specify these as false, true, and false. But if you read the code, new settings, false, true, and false, you have no idea what it means when you're reading the code. You can only figure out what it means by reading the description of the class. Similarly, this also causes issues if I only want to change the sort order from whiskey to rating. You have to specify all the arguments up front, which gets kind of annoying. And it's also unreadable, because what is the 64? What does it stand for? If you read the code, you have no idea, right? I mean, you only know because I've included the class definition in front that it is the page size. Also, why I picked 64, I have no idea. So my slide title already gives this away. PHP now has these named arguments for this, where you basically can only change the argument, the values for the arguments that you specify. So in this case, I'm setting include distillery to false. So now I immediately know what it is for. It's for not including distillery information. And also, I'm not necessary to show any of the other arguments either. Now that wasn't necessary in this example, but it was in this one, right? If I want to change the sort by field to only to rating, then I can do that by just specifying that. And all the other arguments will have the default values. A few caveats about using this. I think named arguments like this are useful for this kind of situation. But by relying on the names of arguments, it also means that the arguments are now part of your public API. Because the moment I change sort by field to sort field, for example, or the other way around, the code will now stop working because the name is now different. And because we no longer have dynamic properties for PHP 8.2, you actually get a warning that now, which is great because that means you made a typo. But what I think you should be really careful about is using this all through your API and always use named arguments, because that does mean that library developers, I'm sure you rely on some libraries written by other people, you can't really force them to add these names, require them to never change the names to their arguments. So you need to be careful by using this by going through different boundaries of who owns the code. Now, if a library author says, yes, you can use named arguments for this class because we won't change it anymore, that's great. But you can't guarantee that libraries that you depend on won't change their names. And as part of this project or feature, we also actually looked at all the argument names in PHP itself, because this named arguments also works for PHP internal functions. And oh boy, there were like 3,000 functions that had so totally inconsistent naming that it took weeks to sort this out. I think we still might miss a few dozen. But yeah, I mean, the date extension sometimes use date, sometimes it use date time, sometimes it use date string, sometimes it use timestamp. You can see where I'm going here, right? We had to go through absolutely everything to change that. I would not recommend you do that for your own personal code unless you make a library where you also tell your users, yes, please use named arguments. The moment you say that, you need to make sure that it's consistent, otherwise, of course, it's annoying for people to use. All right. Static variables in inherited methods. And I don't mean static properties here. No, static variables in inherited method. How often have any of you used a static keyword to declare a variable inside a function? Okay. Are you sure you have done that? Because I looked at all the code that I've written and I've never done this. I think it is one of these features in PHP that is not well known. And I can't actually give you a good use case why I won't want to use this. Because it is sort of a, well, it's a global variable, sort of, isn't it? But in a defined class. I mean, it's all kind of weird. What is even weirder that before PHP 8.0, if you run this code, you get 1212 out of this. Which is a bit odd, because why would it reset itself to 0 when you start calling it on the B class? Now, that's because there was a bug in PHP. Bug, feature, sometimes you don't know what it is, right? In this case, we decided this was a bug. It was a bug because what happened is that the static I in a method was actually scoped to the function where it was called on, not where it was defined on. And in PHP 8.1, we now fixed that by fixing it. And now the result will be 1, 2, 3, 4, which is what most people would expect it to do. So the change here is actually that instead of the static being used on, let me see when I got self and static right. On self, it is now, no, on static, it is now on self. Where the method is defined on is where the box sits that contains this variable. With one exception. The exception is if you had a trait that had a function counter with a static property I in it, defined like I have here in this line, because in PHP, the logic behind traits is that the methods are copied into all the classes where the traits are used. That means in every of these copies, the variable I will have its own bucket. So the counters will not belong to the trait definition, but to the copied definition inside each of the classes. That sounds complicated, but it's totally natural, and that is sort of what you would expect to happen. Now, I've been speaking for about half an hour now. I think it's time to see whether we can actually demonstrate this in our debugger. So I'm going to sit down because I can't type from here. All right, ooh, and also not fall off my chair, that'd be great. All right, so exercise. How many of you have already done this? If not, it's typing time. Now, I have already done my checkout. The checkout of the Git repository is literally like 4 kilobytes or so. So that shouldn't take a lot of time. So I never know whether you're going to be ready or not. So you need to tell me. Hopefully you have all working internet here. I actually haven't tried that yet, but I don't think I need it. Sorry, I didn't understand the question. Yes. Yes. Oh, yes. Okay. Yes, that's what I wanted to know. Thanks. Yes. You have Xdebug output info. You have as well. Okay. If you have that, show your hand. Okay. Oh, that's okay. Maybe. Great. That is good. If you're still working on it, give it a. Anybody still waiting for Docker Compose to load up? Yeah, one in the back. That takes some time because it's downloading like 8 gigabytes over Wi-Fi. It's not that much. But if you're still waiting for that, then I'm eager to switch to my next screen over. I saw most of you have done it. I'm going to continue, otherwise I'm going to run out of time. Let me know if you need any help. All right, so what did I say? Docker Compose up. Is this big enough in the back as well? Yeah, otherwise you can make it a bit bigger. Okay, the first thing mine shows I get a warning, and I'm going to explain you why the warning is for. So yes, this is working. Great. Let me now stop it. You don't have to see what I did there. Something is crashing on my machine, and I don't know what it is. I didn't have to figure out what it is. So let's have a look. You remember the warning, right? It said this environment variable wasn't set. If you look at my Docker Compose file, I have this extra line that says environment xdebug underscore mode, and then it has fill in an environment variable in here. So this is kind of a clever way so that I can use Xdebug in any mode that I want without having to rebuild my Docker container. Because I can just do compose down and compose up, specifying this mode, and then it will operate in this mode. And this is important for Xdebug 3 because if you enable the debug mode, then you don't get code coverage. If you enable tracing, you won't get debugging. And by not enabling many features that you're not needing, Xdebug runs a lot faster. Right. So let me start this now again. It's not set, so it will use the empty string, which is fine because I've already in my PHP INI set which mode I wanted to use. So if I now go through my browser, this was early, don't worry. It will actually tell you. So Xdebug info output is a great way of finding out what is going on and why. So in the first bit, it tells you exactly which modes are enabled, and it also tells you how. So if it says xdebug.mode, it's made with a setting. Now, if I break this again, yeah, I know for sure, and then say xdebug mode is debug, profiling, and then reload this, and then everything crashes. Okay. Okay. Log output has also been increased in such a way that if you mess up, like I've just done, it will tell you exactly why. Now, in Docker, it will tell you this on the output, unless, of course, you set it away as a daemon, or you'll get this in your web server error logs. And what it tells me here is that there's an invalid mode debug, profiling is set, so we're falling back to xdebug.mode setting. Great, because that's sort of what we wanted to. Now, I have probably instead of profiling in this profile. I should have known that because I did write this software. Oh, sorry, I keep switching to the wrong screens. I thought it was profiling, but let's set it for profiling. No errors yet. Then we refresh this. And now indeed it worked, because you see now that the profile is turned on and the debugger, and it also tells you here where the setting came from. So Xdebug will tell you exactly where the settings were made, which saved me so much time debugging things on its own. Also, on the right-hand side here is a little link to the documentation page of this feature. Okay, a few other interesting things. Xdebug 3.2 will have this feature called xdebug.gateway as a pseudo host. Now you might remember that sometimes in the past that you had to use this docker.internal hostname, right? Which I actually still have set up. Basically what this does in most setups, but not all, is that it uses the gateway address of the network that Docker runs in to make a connection through in your IDE. On Linux, you had to make this extra line in your Docker Compose file to make that work, whereas on Mac and Windows it always worked. Now, Xdebug 3.2 will include this xdebug://gateway name to make it work on all of these cases. And more importantly, it also works on almost every occasion where you use WSL2 on Windows, because WS2 makes it sometimes really complicated to actually figure out which IP address to contact to, because it changes all the time, you reboot and stuff like that. So both gateway and name server are meant to make that easier for you. Now, why does it say optional features here? Is because many people use Alpine Linux in Docker because it is a smaller image. It's true, it is a bit smaller. But it also uses under the hood a different C library called Muzzle. I'm not sure whether I pronounce that correctly because nobody's ever told me how to pronounce the word. But they don't implement all the features that PHP needs sometimes, or that Xdebug needs to figure out what is the name server or the gateway. And in that case, you'd say that the optional feature would then say no here because it doesn't have the support for it. Similarly, compressed file support would have worked if I had compiled Xdebug with zlib enabled, which is the default. But in my case, apparently I did not have that enabled, or I didn't have the library when I built my Docker container, so it doesn't have compressed file support. Compressed file support is used for trace files and profiling files to make them a lot smaller. Additionally, it tells you about the systemd private temp directory, which is something you don't run into when you run PHP in Docker often, but if you run it through a web server on usually Ubuntu and Debian, and I think Fedora and Red Hat versions as well, they enable this feature in systemd, the new initd on the Linux system, so that every program has its own special private temp directory, which means that if documentation Xdebug tells you store these files in /tmp, they won't actually be there. And it is kind of hard to figure out what is going on there. But Xdebug info will now tell you whether this is the case, and if it knows what a private temp directory is, it will also tell you that, which is really quite useful to know. Makes it easier to figure out what's going on. Now, the bigger thing here is the messages and warnings that it gives you. So the first one says the file temp docker xdebug could not be opened. It's a bit odd. We like making our log files, but it's kind of obvious if you look at what's happening here. Because I map this docker xdebug in my container to the logs directory in, I mean, actually, probably should show you that. That's better. It's a workshop after all, isn't it? So in my container, there, it shows here that I've this target inside my container, temp docker.xdebug, where I want to put all my log file rubbish in, and I map that to logs in my project. And hence, if you look at your checkout, you see that logs is indeed there because I put a dummy file in it. Sorry. It's true, it's in there. It's called .dummy. But when you clone things from Git, it doesn't always set directory permissions. Because Docker runs as a different user, and that user is not called Derrick, it doesn't actually have the permissions to write into that. So I just need to fix that. And I suggest you do so too. Now, of course, the better way of doing this would be to create a specific group that both the Docker user, but this is the easiest. It's a development machine. Don't do this in production. So making sure the logs is still empty. I probably should do it like that so that people in the back can easier see it as well. It's still empty, as you would expect, because we haven't done anything since then. And if we now refresh in the browser, you see that error message went away because it's no longer there. Curiously, 2 other warnings also went away. That were the ones where the profiler was complaining that it couldn't write into a file. That's correct, because it was trying to write into the same directory. So if I now check again, you'll see indeed 2 files in there now. Xdebug.log, which we'll have a look at in a moment, as well as cachegrind.out, which is my profiling file. Has nothing interesting yet, because the only function that we called was, of course, Xdebug info. No, I was trying to do this. Yeah, so this profile file, absolutely useless. But the log file is useful, so let's have a look at that. Before we do that, there was still one error message left here, right? It says the debugger tried to making a connection to a debugger or an IDE, but couldn't connect to it. Now, the reason should be fairly obvious. Anyone wants to guess why it couldn't make a connection to the IDE? I haven't started them yet. So I will start doing this with VS Code first, and then I'll switch to PHP Storm. Right, switch to. Right, so I've done some of these steps, right? I've fixed the logs directory, I've refreshed the browser, and now I can have a look at the log file itself. The log file says basically anything that is a warning on error shows up in the log, also shows up in Xdebug_info output. But only for warnings and errors. It doesn't show info or debug messages, because it can sometimes be way too much. But in this case, we need to connect to our ID, so we need to start one. So it says start VS Code or PHP Storm. Okay, I've done that. What next? So in VS Code, we need to open the git checkout folder. I can cheat by clicking on this because I've already done so. Otherwise, it's a file open folder. I just click on it. Okay, and you see here my little example with the static properties preloaded. Except that instead of A and B, I'm calling them elephant and pachyderm, because everybody likes elephants. So I've done that. Open the file static properties. But VS Code is a little bit different than PHP Storm, is that you need to create like a launch configuration. So the launch configuration, if you click the Run and Debug tab, it has a link for you. You just click it, and now you have created one. It's kind of simple. In PHP Storm, of course, you don't have to do this because you can just click the little triangle. I'll show you that in a moment. So let's save this. We click the Listen for Xdebug Connections link. And then what we want to do now is we want to debug static properties, right? Now, because we know we want to debug it, I'm setting a breakpoint here. And now in the browser, I'm going to static properties. Static properties. Let's hope I don't make any typos. And I get the output, but it didn't pop up in the debugger, which is a very often occurring thing to happen. Oh God, I'm really silent. Somebody turn off the echo. Okay, so now the log is still open. Let's have a look what actually shows up in the log. Oh, there's so many things in there. So what actually happened here? It says connecting to the configured address. Yeah, we're expecting that. It says it's connected. If you see that, it means like the debugger actually connected. So that's good news. And then you see in some protocol information going over, which is useful. Because I've set my log level to 10, it also tells you exactly what it is trying to match my debug breakpoints again. So it says that we're currently trying to run this line of code. And we're trying to match this breakpoint that we have set by clicking on the little dots to the location for our HTML static properties. You probably can see what the problem is here, right? Although it has the name of the file correct, the paths are very different. So in this case, it has workshop PHP camp or webcam 22, and here just var www. Now the reason for this is that on my local system where my IDE runs, the paths are much more complicated because I have all my development projects in dev/project. Whereas in my Docker container, I've just stuck everything in var www. But Xdebug doesn't know about this. It only can see what's actually running on the system. So it doesn't know how to translate these things. That means that you need to tell IDEs to do this kind of thing. Now, PHP Storm automatically pops up a window when it can't match paths, but in VS Code you need to tell it specifically. And this kind of thing is called path mappings. This is what I wanted to use VS Code for, because in PHP Storm this gets sort of abstracted away. Now, how do we do this? Well, we first stop the debugger. It's not like I did anything useful anyway. Go to my launch thing, and then you can make your path mapping. And in the path mappings, luckily it auto-completes this because I can never remember any of the options. And we need to map what is in the container with what is local. Full path necessary. Workshop. Okay, this button is sort of in the way. Now, I've added the HTML at the end, but that's not really strictly necessary because it's the same on both sides. So maybe you should just remove it. I now save this with Control S and then start running debug again. Listen. Anybody wants to guess where that works now? Fingers crossed. I reload this and okay, you can hardly see, but it is still waiting to do something in my browser. That's usually a good sign. So let me now switch back to the IDE, and indeed it has stopped on my breakpoint because we've now done the right path mapping. All right, so the locals, super globals, is not important right now. So let's now step into this by doing step in, which is F11, which is really annoying as a key combination because F11 is also full screen. And it took me a while to figure out how to make this full screen. I remapped full screen to Shift Control F11 to make that work. Yes. So let's step into this and see what happens. So the first time it says that I is uninitialized because it still doesn't know what it is. And then when I step beyond that, it now knows I is 0 because that's how we have initialized it. Now, the triple double colon, I'm not sure what the Hebrew for that is. I know the double colon because you sometimes get to see that in error messages in PHP. What would have been really nice, and I only realized with this when I was actually making this this presentation earlier, is that it also includes all these static properties under Elephant, but it doesn't because I'd never thought about doing that. I've made a feature request for myself. So we can return. So I press step into once again, and then it pops in the next line. I do that once more. Let me do the second one. So now, after I step over the static I, it already remembers it was 1, and it doesn't do the assignment. But this is something else now, and that is something new. It's like we just stepped out of return ++ I. And it now stopped at this line, and it shows the return value 2. underscore underscore return value is not a real variable. It is a pseudo variable that Xdebug now introduces to show you what the return values of functions are. And I found it so useful, especially if you have things like fluent interfaces. If you wanted to see what the intermediate steps were, you'd always have to break it up in a new line and assign it to a variable. Whereas now with showing the return value, you don't have to do that anymore. It does mean that there's one extra step of stepping when you step out of a function. So this is why I have to click one more time, and you see my line didn't change because it now moved from the return line to the assignment line. Of course, we're not assigning anything here, so you don't see anything happening there. So this new return value thing is actually really quite useful. Now, at the moment, IDEs need to opt in into this feature. VS Code has already done so. PHP Storm has not yet, and it seems unlikely that I manage to do that before their next release. Which puts me in a odd spot, because I like people to use this new feature because it's really useful, but it can't because the IDE doesn't support it. So what I've done currently is I forced this feature on, but only in one version of Xdebug so far, which is why I was very specific about using Xdebug 3.2.0 Alpha 3, because that's the only one that forces on this feature. Now, I'll be switching to PHP Storm now. With this feature forced on, I stopped listening for debugging. That's important. Otherwise, I can't do it with PHP Storm. PHP Storm is in this window here. I don't know how to make this font bigger. I tried really hard. I just can't do it with this bit here. In any case, I need to create a new project from existing files. Select the one. The sources are in a local directory. No web server is configured. That's right. Our web server runs on Docker. I know this is way too small. I mean, I can hardly read it on my own screen here. Click Next. Select my project, which is Dev Workshop. Where did it go? Click Create. And then now we'll start indexing on the whole system. So in about 15 minutes, we're done. No, it's not that bad. It warns about a few things here, but we'll just ignore these things. I do know how to make the font here bigger. And enable my tabs again. So let's try it in here. So I'm opening the static properties. Yeah, open. Click my breakpoints. I've not set up anything. This is a new project, by the way. I go to run at start listening for connections. Everybody fingers crossed. See whether it actually works the first time. Never does. I reloaded the page. It's still waiting, so that's a good sign. And indeed, on the PHP Storm side, it actually has popped up this window. And this is the PHP Storm's way of seeing that, well, we had this file path on the server. It says var www HTML static properties. But because this is not a real part of my in my project, if it was, then you run into real issues, because then you have potentially two different copies of things. But it suggests what the file is in your project that matches to it. Now, this works fine as long as the HTML is your root of your project. In most cases, that is of course not true, because everything in HTML will probably only be your router. So you are going to have to fix the path mappings later yourself. So let me just accept this for now. Just make sure that it stops on this line. So I did mention that PHP Storm has not enabled this new return value feature yet, right? But I've turned it on regardless. So let me just step in a few times, step over the return, and it does show the return value. So PHP Storm doesn't actually need support for it. However, they can make it better by changing this icon to, ooh, this is a fancy fake property, so that you know what's going on here. Now, because it currently says value of primitive type, if it's fixed in there, and I've seen it in a private build, then it says it's a return value, not this fake thing that I've come up with pretty much. So I am now wondering, should I leave this feature on by default? and basically let PHP Storm users turn it off, or so the reason why I'm asking that the people that make PHP Storm, they would like me not to do that. So do I make you wait half a year for this feature or not? You want to show of hands. Who wants to wait 6 months? Okay, I don't, and who doesn't? Okay, okay. That's my argument made. 100 out of 100% of people thought. Hey, there's license statistics, isn't it? The joke is better than I remember it now. But in any case, yes. So what I've tried to show you is this new feature, return value. I've showed you Xdebug_info with this wild amount of information to help you figure out what's going on. And basically, any Stack Overflow question that I see now, the debugger doesn't work. I'm going to point them to this section of the workshop because I'm recording it. I'm sorry, you. Hopefully, yeah. You're recording as well. Yeah. It's working this time. Sorry. That joke. Anyway, the debugger. I will stop this now so I can continue with my presentation. But I do need to turn off listening, otherwise it's trying to debug every slide as well that I'm doing, which is not what I want to do. Ooh. That is because I aborted the script, not because something crashed. No worries about it. However, it shouldn't have crashed like this. I'm going to have to dive into that later at some point. That was the exercise. Hopefully you could walk along a little bit. If not, then hopefully I showed you something useful. It's 3:30. Let's go back to new features in PHP. We have something called new initializers. This is a new feature in 8.0, not in 8.0, in 8.1 that makes this kind of pattern easier. If, for example, you wanted a default argument into my logger construct, in order to do that, setting a default empty class, which we instantiate with new no-logger, you had to do this in your constructor like this. There was no other way around it. Well, what PHP 8.1 allows you to do is to set these things in initializers. So there are a few caveats here. You can do this for just class names. You can also use arguments or named arguments in there if you want to do that as well. But this new initializer you can't use in every location yet. It is particularly handy for this specific case where you want to have this default object instantiation so that you don't have to do the test for example, new no-logger yourself. As I said, you can also give it arguments if you want to do that, or you can even use named parameters if you want to do that as well. So these are basically new default objects that you can set. But where can you use them? Well, you can use them as static variables. You remember the static variables from the thing that we just shown. So instead of using =0, I can have a object in it and do operations on that if I want to do that. It can be used for constants. So if constant db is database link and use a named argument, you do need to be a little bit careful about order of definition, because you can't really make use of things that aren't defined in the same files sometimes. But probably where the best use is, or this is actually not part of the feature. It is a side effect of the implementation of the feature. So PHP 8.0, 8.1. I'm going to say 8.0, but I might be off by one. Allows these attributes for different elements in PHP. And these attributes are basically a PHP compiler assisted way of doing like the dot blocks that you might remember from the first slide, where I define a union with @var, int, or float. So attributes like this, they are actually parsed by the PHP engine. And you can also make use of this information through Reflection API. So if you would do reflection on the login class, you can get the attributes on this class, and you will be able to see the constraint that the amount of tries for logging in, I suppose, you can only do 3 times. Now, this whole new tries 3 wasn't possible before we had this new initializer functions, because basically the arguments to constraints are just like normal PHP arguments. I mean, we probably never documented like that, but that's how it works under the hood. Because you can now do new initializers, that's a hard word, it also allows you to do this new tries 3 in there, which sorts of solves this whole problem of not having nested attributes automatically without having to create more logic in the PHP parser to allow you for having nested properties in here, which is kind of a nice way of getting around this PHP 8.0 unfeature or missing feature, like some people thought it was. So this is kind of a nice way of having that. Now, I also would say that I really quite like that we ended up with attribute syntax in PHP 8.0 that starts with pound and then the square bracket open. And the reason for this is that if your PHP that you're using does not support attributes, it's just a comment. Because comments in PHP can start with a hashtag or pound sign, or how you want to call these things. Which allows actually us now in PHP 8.2 to disable dynamic properties, but you can enable them yourself by an attribute. Or at least that was the original idea. We didn't end up doing that. Because sometimes we come up with ideas and then implement them slightly differently. But what is possible is that there is a few features in PHP 8.1 and 8.2 where we change the internal return, where we add return types to some functions, but in such a way that if you would use that syntax in PHP 7.4, which some of you probably still use, wouldn't be valid in PHP 7.4. Which isn't great. But by adding an attribute to it in that case, means that PHP 8.1 can enable this thing without it being a problem for PHP 7.4, because for PHP 7.4, this is just a comment and it strips it out. So it actually ended up being quite useful that it was comments, even though when we were vigorously discussing the syntax of things, of attributes, most of the discussions get heated over syntax, not necessarily over how it works. I would like to see that the other way around, because more scrutiny on functionality is useful, less scrutiny on syntax is useful. And I'm very happy that we went for pound sign, square bracket opening and closing, as opposed to the 2 @ signs, because that would never have allowed us to do things like this, which I think is great. Yes, so I'm a fan of this. New things, enumerations in PHP 8.1. So I should not have skipped slides definition. So enumerations is a data type consisting of a set of named variables. Definitions are boring, so let's just show that instead. So let's say you have a currency and you can only have in your application 2 possible values for currency. I've picked the Great British Pound and the Euro here. Other currencies are available too. With enumerations is a way so that you can type against these values directly. So if I have a class product, my constructor accepts a bunch of arguments. So we have the name of a product, the amount, and the currency. And we type this with the currency enumeration name. It looks just like a class name, doesn't it? That is because under the hood, it is just a class name. Or rather, it's a parent's class name. What actually happens under the hood is that if you create this enum currency definition, it actually creates 2 static classes. Static classes aren't really a thing in PHP, but the engine understands these things. And each of these is then inherited of the currency class. Sorry, enumeration. It actually is a class, but let's call it an enumeration. Which means that if you call new product with chili, the name of my elephant, the value, well, if only it was still €5.50, and I then specify the currency by using this double colon with EUR. The PHP engine will validate whether that actually fits in the currency enumeration, and if not, you'll get an error. If it works, you get this var dump. This is a lie. This is a var dump of what happened before var dump understood what enumerations were. And I specifically haven't updated the slide yet because it shows you under the hood that currency is actually just a class. It is well, there's multiple classes. There's one where the property is EUR, and there's also one where the property is GBP. And PHP under the hood handles these things. But yeah, under the hood, it is a class. Now, what you can't do, luckily, is that if you pass in EUR as a string, instead of using the enumeration sub-value, you'll get an error message that says, argument 3 currency must be of type currency, and you've given it a string. A string does not match with the enumeration values on purpose. Because if it would do, we could also put in a string, for example, yeah, now I don't remember what the currency code is for the crown. Can anybody help me? Sorry, delay. No, now I forgot the currency here. Karuna, that's the one. Crown, kuna, yes. I always thought that was HRK, that's what it is. I thought kuna was a translation of crown. Weasel. The animal. Okay. So my translation was less weird in that case, even though it was wrong. Why is it weasel? Tell me later. I'm curious to know now. Okay. I know that in Romania they use lions, which I think is even better. In any case, you can't use that. You can only use the, how do you call it, the enumeration values and not strings. Because if you would pass in anything else, then you'd still want PHP to match that. But matching strings against not strings, how do you now know which of the options it is, right? So you can't do this. There are ways of converting strings to enumeration values. Which brings me to the next point, that enumerations can be backed. And in this case, they are backed by the currency sign. So I use the pound sign or the euro sign in this case. And if you then do a var dump, you'll see that there's an extra property, is that not only does it have a name, it also has a value now. Right. This is kind of useful because you can make use of these values. Because you can access the value of the enumeration constant static thing. I don't think we've come up with a name for what currency : EUR stands for. Enumeration value? That seems reasonable, doesn't it? I don't think we've ever come up with a documentation name for it. But in any case, you can access the value and then you get the value out of it. So the backed type can only be an integer or a string. I can't tell you why. I don't think we thought it'd be more useful that you could also use other values, other types, because strings and integers are also the only types you can use as array keys, for example. Yes, but I don't remember why. I don't think it stops you from implementing toString on it. Let's try it then. Okay, so the reason why, okay, for that I do have a clean answer. We actually had a feature request to allow for this. But if you allow an enumeration to be cast to a string in any context, then you lose the type safety of it. So that is the reason why it doesn't happen automatically. And that is probably also the underlying reason why you can't define toString on it. But I thought you could. Let me copy and paste this. Now, of course, if I make any syntax errors, please let me know. Okay, I haven't shown you that you can actually define functions on enumerations, but you can. What should it return? This value? That would make sense, right? Why self value probably should also work. But let's try this. And you're probably right that it will error out. Indeed, you cannot do this because it would violate the type safety. However, what you can of course do, I mean this is a bit pointless, but you can current, hard to type, isn't it? Oh. And then it does work, of course. Sorry. So yeah, the reason is type safety. I know that the Symfony people were quite keen on having this feature. And we pretty much convinced them that it was a bad idea. And then Nicholas disagreed. And then he was sad. But I think it's the right decision. I mean, the whole idea of enumeration is that you have the type safety of an enumeration. And when you then let it degrade to string, then you lose that. So yes, I'm not sure what changes they're going to make in Symfony, if anything at all. I think the main issue is that I didn't want to use the dash value on it and saving 7 characters instead of breaking type safety with enumerations, which only feature was really type safety. Doesn't seem like a good trade-off. So, yeah. All right, sorry, I skipped over a slide. Okay, so however, it is possible also to go the other way around, convert a backed value to an enumeration instance. So what you can do is by using the from method, which automatically gets implemented for you, you don't have to do that. And I don't think you can actually override it, but I haven't tried it. Yeah, you can give it any of the backed values. If it works, if it is one of them, then you will get that specific enumeration instance back. If it isn't one, you'll get a type error, I believe. Or at least an exception of some sort, which is a useful thing to have. However, if you don't necessarily know what gets passed in, you can also use try from. And try from will never throw an exception. It will either return an enumeration instance or it will return null, which gives you the opportunity to throw everything in there. And if it isn't a valid backed value, you don't get an exception. Because there's probably situations where this is useful. I mean, if you pass in the value as a get parameter, for example, I mean, everybody can change the get parameters to something else, right? Hacking, as some newspapers call that. And that you don't want the application to break down with an exception, for example. Yes, I've already demonstrated this by just having made the example, but it is possible to define functions on enumerations, which is what I've done here. Is I've created a function called format, and depending on the currency, it uses a different format of formatting the currency number. This also shows a new feature, I think, also in PHP 8.0, which is the match operator. And a match operator is like switch, but it returns a value, in this case into pattern, and the list of options in match, the right side of the arrow can only be a single expression. So you can't have anything more complicated in there unless you use an anonymous function, for example. But in this case, what we're doing is if the currency is GBP, then we put the pound sign at the end. And if it is EUR, then we put the euro sign at the start. That is not great localization, but it just serves as an example here, right? And then we use what is returned from this expression. The expression in the, well, I don't know what we've passed in yet. So for example, if it is matching GBP, the string this value with a percent sign is then assigned to pattern, because that's what match does. And then we're using the pattern with sprintf to format the number. So for example, this is a lie because I picked the wrong pattern. I've just noticed that. But it formats it with a pound sign, and if we do the other way around, then it happens the other way around. Similarly, what you can also do is use a method on an enumeration to create it depending on some other value. So in this case, if it's, for example, Dutch NL, then we want to use a euro sign. If it is Italy, then we want to use a euro sign. If it's the UK, then we want to use GBP. And by passing in the locale, you can then, for example, return the right enumeration value that you would want to match to the locale that we're putting in. I think UKGB is actually Ukrainian in Great Britain. I don't think that is an actual locale though. That's you don't know. So you can use it as an alternative constructor to construct its enumeration instances from something else, which I think is a useful feature as well. A few other things. You can list all the values in there by using cases. Again, this vardump is created from before vardump understood what enumerations are. But it shows it a bit better in my opinion here. You can also get all the properties from them. Oh no, you can't. So this is something that is kind of interesting, and this is what popped up recently in the run-up to PHP 8.2, is that how do you deal with this kind of thing? I mean, we want a constant array of prices where on the left-hand side we have EUR, and then on the right-hand side the actual price. Now, this is a bit of a contrived example, but you can't actually do this because constant expressions contain invalid operations, and the invalid operation in this case is the enumeration instance on the left-hand side. You can't do that in PHP 8.2 either. Instead, what you can do is access the value property on enumerations. So this is a new feature called, I think it's called fetch properties in initializers or something like that. It has this really long name that I forgot. So you can access these properties now in these assignments, but originally the idea was to allow that on all kinds of objects in PHP and initializers, but the 8.2 feature is to only allow that for enumerations. Because enumerations don't have any side effects here, on normal classes, accessing properties can actually modify code. Accessing a property like value, if the value wasn't defined and there is an underscore get method, for example, the underscore get method could actually change something in the object because it just runs normal code. Because of that and some other edge cases, we actually did not add it. We didn't end up adding this feature for all objects across the board and only allowed for enumerations. This made the Symfony people slightly more happy. That's all. We got a bunch of all kinds of other useful types. We got the never type, the never return type. The never return type says that this method never returns. Or rather, there will be no code after this function ends. So that is in this case because we call exit, but it also happens if your function always throws, for example. Of course, you can catch these things, but the end of the function is never reached. And PHP will enforce this. So if you end up returning from the function, you actually get an error saying that you returned from this function and you weren't supposed to. And it will tell you. Is this useful? I don't know. To be honest, I don't think this is that useful. The only reason why you would use this is either if you have an exit on there, or if you have like a throw, a method that only throws or throws in every case. And this was requested by people that make static analyzers, because by being able to say that this method returns, they can infer a whole lot of other things about this method, which in which case is kind of useful. But from a runtime point of view, I don't really see the use of it because I know my method doesn't return, it has exit in it. So why do I need to tell the engine that it is there? You can also do it for implicit methods, so if you want to do that. So remarks is just like void. You can only use it as a return type, not as an argument type. So void can't be used as an argument. And it is a bottom type. That means that you can't inherit from this and changing the type for something more useful. Right, let's get into some more type stuff. In PHP 8.0 and earlier, if you want to have a enforcement that a specific object that you pass in to be of two interfaces, in this case, traversable or countable, you had to come up with a clutch like this. You see what I'm trying to do here, right? So I have two private properties. They are called traversable and countable. They're both nullable and defined as null. And I have a private both, also identified to null. And then in my constructor, what I'm doing, I'm setting this traversable to a reference to both. And the same thing with countable. And then here with this both, I assign the countable iterator in my original argument. So what does it end up doing is that because of this reference to both types, which are typed, the engine would make sure that the type then matches with a reference variable. And if it doesn't, you get an exception. But because there's two of them with two different types, your object is then guaranteed to be of both types. This is quite a hack. Again, don't do this in production code, please. Upgrade to PHP 1 instead, where you can then just type it like that, so that you don't have to think about it yourself. So this is an example from PHP internals. Having to require traversable and countable is quite a common thing to do because of the way how these interfaces are actually implemented in PHP, which might not have been the best design choice in the past, but we can't change them. So it also means that you can use this in your own code yourself. Do any of you see any use for this at some point? PHP unit mocks, yeah, that could be one. Yeah, in that case, yeah, I've seen it for serialize and unserialize in other cases as well. Yeah, that's where this kind of thing is kind of useful. So that came in PHP 8.1 out last year. You can only do this for class or interface names. You can't do int and float because that makes no sense whatsoever. Or bool and false also makes no sense because it can't be false and not false at the same time. Or it can't be true and false at the same time. The variance rules are also respected, but they're kind of complicated. Basically, it means that, let me see if I get this right, because this is complicated. In an inherited class, you can always make your arguments bigger. So which means that if you inherit set iterator, to make traversable or countable wider, you get to drop one of them, right? Because if your original method requires traversable and countable, and your inherited method only requires traversable, there's nothing wrong with that. With a return type, it's the other way around. You can only make it narrower, so you could add another interface to it if you wanted to do that. Don't see a lot of use cases for that, but PHP will do this correctly. They are more complicated than the minute overview I just gave you. Another so I just like a slide with some color on it, and I like Apple, so there we go. This is actually something new in PHP 7.4. You have an array of apples, a red apple and a green apple. You have some fruits, a pear, a peach. You want to include the apples. This is called array unpacking with string keys. Well, not this one, but the next example. And then we have a strawberry and a tomato, and that makes a fruit salad. Technically, they're all fruits. I wouldn't put a tomato in a fruit salad. But Biologists would, I think. I don't. In PHP 8.1, what we add support for here is also string keys. So if you have apples, which is red points to a red apple, green points to a green apple, and then others is green pear and a pink peach. Not sure peaches are actually pink, but as an example. And with fruits, you can use the ... operator again to basically go over all the elements in an array and insert them at this point. And so I do that for the apples first and then for the others. But as you can see, there's two things named green, and the last one wins. This is the same semantics as if you use the plus operator between arrays. That's why it overrides previous array keys. This is really useful if you have classes that work on like options sort of things, because you can very easily set default options now. So you have the default options, which in my case is the apples, and then you add the others, which is what your users have configured. You add it on top, and it will override everything in there with the array keys. And if it hasn't been set, it will use the original one, which is a nice way of merging this kind of thing with a splat operator without basically having to create a loop over it at some point. Also, apples, pears, and peaches in a fruit salad is a lot better than having tomatoes in it. Now, fibers. Fibers is something that came in PHP 8.1. It is a way of cooperative multitasking. So PHP traditionally never had any kind of threads in it. Right? Not sure how many of you have ever tried programming threads in C or C++. I have. I don't think I'm clever enough for this, because there's so many edge cases and race conditions and stuff like that. Now, languages like Golang do this in a different way, where nothing really runs at the same time and you have to pass things through with channels. Now, PHP doesn't have either of these features. And then at some point, somebody came up with a tool called Swool, which does do this kind of coroutines in PHP with things running not concurrently, but what's the word for that? Cooperatively. Yeah, that says so on my slide. Thanks. So this is called cooperative multitasking. Software that also did that in the past, Windows 3.1. I'm not sure if any of you have ever used that. I have. And the way how multitasking was implemented there, it also didn't have threading, was basically at points during the execution of methods, or I think it was GUI drawing stuff. It says, now is the time for some other program, if they want to do something, to do something. So a task would suspend itself, so another task could pick up. Now, PHP is not Windows 3.1 or 3.11, thank God, because it would be 16 bits, of course. We're now in a 64-bit era, if not more. But fibers are really quite hard to understand. So I have created an example that we get to debug to sort of try to explain how these works. And I've practiced this several times, and I wasn't right every single time. So let's hope we go through it now in one go. Just checking for time, and I'm not going to run over. Okay. 52 minutes, that's plenty. I'm not going to take 52 minutes by going through fibers, no worries. So let's open up the debugger. PHP store? Yes? No? Yes. Okay. Let me open the fiber one. I don't really need to see what's in here much. No, I do. See, this is, I sort of like having the VS Code way of having all the, how do you call that? The variables to the left-hand side. It works better with screen as state when giving presentations, but we'll do this one. Excuse me. Now, I have to say something before we start doing this, that fibers, although you can implement them yourself in code, I would probably suggest that you don't. Instead, use frameworks that make use of these fibers. There's something, oh, what's the name of it? It isn't called Volt. It had a silly name. Now I can't remember it. It is a successor of React. No, it's a successor of AMP PHP. I can't remember the name now. I'll remember at some point. The authors of the framework that made use of this kind of stuff before, they implemented this so that PHP under the hood can use these concurrent tasks. But it doesn't have a lot of helper functionality to it. So if you want to make use of it yourself, you have to re-implement that stuff all the time. That gets very complicated. So if you make use of fibers, then I would very much recommend you look into these frameworks and use those instead, because they will handle so many edge cases around the simple example that I'm showing you here now. Yeah. Okay, I will speak a bit faster now. That's a joke I have. I'll be okay. Right, so... Yeah. Okay. At least I don't have 40 minutes, let's put it that way. Okay. So I've set my breakpoint here on the first line base, pretty much, line 15. So what I'm also going to start it if that's okay. Because otherwise the debugger doesn't do anything if I click buttons. Fibers. Not found. Yeah. It's handy if you have 50, 40 people that help you debug things. Great. Okay, it didn't do anything. That makes sense. Because I hadn't started the debugger. Okay, let's go. Okay, now it didn't do anything, right? So now it's spinning here. We're not really going to bother what it shows in the browser, to be honest. But we're going to look at what it does under the hood here. So the first thing that this little script does, it creates a stream socket pair. And it does that for doing some communication. There's nothing to it with fiber, so we'll just step over it. And it says now we have two stream resources. At some point, PHP is going to remove resources and change them to objects, because resources is like such an outdated thing. But at the moment, we still have them. Long-term plan. We set the blocking mode of these, and you already see that the return value is now also doing something. Again, this is this new step. Now, what I'm going to look at some point, that if there's no assignment of the return value, I might not show this. But I haven't figured out whether that is useful or not. Stream set blocking, same thing. And now we create an event loop. And an event loop is basically used by the fibers to keep track of what is going to need to happen. This is something that you have to implement yourself. If you look at this, this is pretty much the standard implementation that I stole from the RFC. Sorry, borrowed from the RFC. And it basically is a way where, so that you can put tasks in this event loop, and the event loop will then loop through the tasks, see whether there's something to do with them, and then execute them. We should see that when stepping through. So we create this new event loop. Is there anything in the constructor? There's nothing in the constructor. And then we create a new fiber. This fiber is an anonymous function. You have to do it like that, otherwise things get executed immediately, which is something you don't want to do. We're creating this fiber with this embedded function that is then our task. So we then say, well, we wait for data. Fiber gets current, gets the current fiber if it's there. We read some data, and then call this anonymous function fiber resume. So if there is data for us, then we do something with it and call resume. And then we suspend the fiber so something else can pick up. Oh, let me step over this because it's not going to do anything just yet, because it's just a definition of the fiber. It gets a return value in this case, of course, which is null, which makes no sense to me, but I'll investigate that later. So we have this fiber now, and we start the fiber. So step into this. And when we start the fiber, it starts executing the code in the anonymous function in there. So we show waiting for data, which you will then also, well, hasn't flushed the buffer yet, so you won't see in there. And maybe here, in the output here, we'll show you waiting for data now, which is what I've just output. We get the current fiber, and the return value is now fiber, which is what we expect. And then we call the loop, and in the loop we call read with as task resume the fiber. So this basically, if you step into here, so we create an ID for this. We set the read resource for this one, for this ID that we've just created to the resource, which is our read stream. And then we set the stream callbacks for this one with the same ID as well, to the callback. So this doesn't do anything. We've just basically pushed the task with an ID that we've just created to the event loop. And this doesn't do anything. Now we call fiber suspend. And that's basically the fiber started order to the event loop, but we haven't done anything yet. And now, although the fiber started, it doesn't run because nothing is suspended, right? But now when we want to write something that we then want to read in the fiber, we call this defer function on the loop. In the defer, we create a next ID again, which now is the B. And we set the defer callback also to the callback. So if something happens, so this is then the read task that we've pushed after the write task. And now we run the loop. And the loop will then start. What do loops start? Start at the start of the loop, right? So it first checks if there is no defer callbacks or read things, then we just done with the loop. But of course, we should have a few. So what is there in defer callbacks? There's just this B task, which has two closures in it. Sadly, you can't see what the code was that belongs to this closure. That'd be really nice, but it's also not possible. So sorry. What is in the read callback? What is in read? Nothing, because, sorry, that's an array. An array has a, sorry, let me put it to the top. I know this is very low on the screen for the people in the back. The read still has this resource in it, which is our read resource. Okay, what happens next? It's not empty, so we continue going. So the defer is we first get the whole array and then set it to nothing. Basically, we're reading all the defers, set it to 0 so that we don't continue looping over that. So doing that, and then we loop over them and just basically call the callback that belongs to it. So the first one is the first is now B, and it has two closures in it. Step over that. So the first now is closure. It has the static information, which is our write stream, and then the closure itself is our callback. So if we call this now, we'll see that we jump into this write callback, because that's the one we have defined for doing this, because that's what we deferred to it, right? Run it. It does write to the string with a return value of 13. fWrite returns the length of the string. And then, after we've called a defer, we now call select on the loop, which checks if there are timeouts. We try to read from the stream, which is what this line does, and it returns 1, so that's good. So that meant there was data available on the stream. We read through all of the streams that we have defined. That's what this loop does. So we only have one read stream defined, so we only read one. Read that, figure out the callback for this, unset it so that we don't have it in an array anymore, and then call the callback, which is then what we had defined, which is again this closure with this fiber in it. When we then run that, it then calls the fiber resume here. And then we suspend the fiber again. Then we do the read. The return value of that is hello world. And now we have received this data. So what we ended up doing is if we pushed callbacks to the loop to read the data when something was available on the stream, then we send data to it. And in the loop, we then process that in the right order to then do the receive data. So we basically send, in the same process, data while waiting for it before we have sent it. And normally you can't do that because you have, of course, blocking data. If you send something and nothing is reading it, your program doesn't continue because you haven't read it yet, because you can't, because it has been sent yet. So that is the sort of the thing that fibers solve here. There's another read which does not know anything now, and basically we're now at the end of our loop. This is kind of complicated for basic examples, but it is kind of a nice way. I don't think actually, let me run this one more time to show you that it actually has multiple routines in there. I will not be paying to any of the output, but only to what the stack is here. We'll just continue until something interesting happens. At some point we'll end up in a fiber. And you can see that the stack is now different here. Instead of it starting with main in the bottom, it actually shows you the start of the fiber with its fiber ID. Because this is no longer main, it is actually a different stack. And PHP will know how to switch between these stacks as well as Xdebug. Because if Xdebug didn't know about it, you get all kinds of functions in weird orders. Because every time we'll just add a function when you call one, and when you remove one, and then switch stacks, it gets all messed up. Now what Tool does, it does do things in a similar way, but without some of the APIs that allows debuggers and other tools to know when a switch happens between fibers, which means that you can't build a stack correctly or do debugging correctly. And they forked Xdebug and implemented something themselves, but it doesn't really work. Because it has never, Xdebug hasn't been made with Spool in mind, and Spool hasn't been created with Xdebug in mind, whereas the fibers that are part of PHP 8.1 have specifically been designed to work with all the other tools, including Xdebug, to make sure this all works. Fibers. Interesting subject, more complicated than I even just gave. And I think there are some presentations on the internet where fibers get explained in much greater detail, and it takes about an hour. And I only had 20 minutes and a little bit less. This makes sense in some way. I thought it was kind of useful to I stepped through this quite quickly. I would suggest at some point, if you find a time next week, to do the same exercise and go step by step to exactly seeing where in the stack things are, which fiber is being executed, on which line, and what all the return values are. Because it makes it a lot more easier to understand than reading the RFC. Okay, I stopped the debugger. Go back to my slides. Fibers, cooperative multitasking. Okay, I just had a slide in case you wanted to walk along, but I forgot about it. I have a bunch of other tiny features that I'd just like to talk about. Now, if we have a constant, that is the speed of light in a universe, then you can now mark them as final, meaning that no pseudoscientist can change the speed of light. Now, of course, this is only software. You can't change the speed of light either at all. But if you then tried to override an inherited class, you're saying that, no, you can't change the speed of light. I think this is sometimes useful in combination with traits, where if you have a trait that makes use of constants, which I don't think you actually can, but if you could, it makes sense. You can't change them, which makes, and I think this is actually a reason. I don't actually remember where we added constants to traits now. That is an 8.2, isn't it? Yeah, I remember reading the discussion, but I didn't remember whether it was accepted or not, but I think it was. And in combination with this feature, now makes a lot more sense, because now you can have constants in there, you don't want in an inherited content change the constant, because if you use this constant for making a switch in something that a trait does, you cannot now change that in an inherited class, which I think makes a lot of sense to now be able to mark those as final. Because from what I remember, although methods and traits you can alias to a different method, you can't do that with the constants. So that's why this makes sense to mark them as final. So yeah, no more changing the speed of light. Okay, I mentioned that in PHP 8.0 we got as union types and we got the false types. But you could never use false just on its own, only as part of a union. And the same thing with null. So you could use false, actually it was worse with false. You could only use it as, yeah, oh no, that's what I just said. You can use it with string or false, but not on its own. Because on its own it wouldn't be a type, it would have been a value. Same thing with null. You could not use null or false either. You had to use null or bool, which is not the same as null or false. You can also not use null standalone, even though it's a narrower type than user or null. So if you had an inherited method, you wanted to return just null. So because this is the always null use finder, which can be useful in tests, for example, or mocks, whatever, you couldn't actually type in that because null on its own wasn't allowed, even though technically it does follow the LSP principle, but that's principle twice. English, difficult. So yeah, so void means do not return anything, and null was does return the null value. So you couldn't express these things. So PHP 8.2 will now actually add support for null and false as their individual types, but true or false, you would not ever coerce to it. So you can only use false and true as actual values, not 0 or 1. Not even if you have strict types set to 0. Yeah, we also never had a true type, so we added that as well. Yeah. Minor additions. Okay, to add on the complexity of more complicated types. So in PHP 8.0 we got our union types. Actually, example. With the indent float from earlier. We got pure intersection types in PHP 8.1. And it says pure intersection types because otherwise you could also use the or sign in between, and that was too complicated. And in PHP 8.2 we now get disjunctive normal form types, which is a combination of intersection types and union types, but only in this specific form. You can only have a union of intersections. You cannot have an intersection of unions. You also will almost never need that, but it is sometimes useful to have a union of intersections. Typical example from internal PHP stuff, if you want to for each over something, it could either be an array or traversal and countable, which is what this current one says. Now, you might notice that my syntax in here says an intersection on this side, and of course array is not an intersection, but array is an intersection of itself, so that is sort of also an intersection. What you can't do is array or traversable and then and countable, because then you have an intersection of unions. Was there a question? Yes, there is a missing pipe. Yes. Thanks. I'll fix that later too. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think this is valid syntax. I think what has happened is that when I add the highlighting, I might have misplaced the character. Because usually I copy and paste these examples after I've tested them, because that's the clever thing to do. Alright, so last things is deprecating dynamic properties is something that we've done in PHP 8.2, where if you use a property that hasn't been declared, you'll get a warning now. And in PHP 9, potentially, you'll get a type error or some kind of other exception-y thing. And the funny thing is that I didn't think nobody makes typos. And then I was upgrading some of my older code to PHP 8.2 by running tests over it, and I actually found an example in like 15 seconds. So what we're doing here is that although we have a declared property, somebody misspelled palette with pallets. And when you then assign it, I mean, in this case it's fine, but it's protected, right? So although we defined something as protected, this property would have been public. Although we wanted to have it as private. We didn't have any tests for that either. Fancy that. So when I ran the tests over this, it actually showed me immediately, exactly this. It says deprecated, creation of dynamic property, palette is deprecated. And then I looked at the code and say, oh yeah, typo. This is probably going to be the most common case. You have declared properties, but you have made spelling errors in them. Everybody makes spelling errors, just like me. So for that, it's actually kind of useful. Now, there are a few situations where, so that was my fix. There are a few situations where you actually want dynamic properties. Some ORMs use them, some testing functionality uses it. I know PHP Code Sniffer uses it extensively for setting options on sniffs that are inherited and things like that. So it is still allowed to use dynamic properties in two situations. You can either extend the class from std class, because std class is a built-in PHP class that you can't define properties on because it's a built-in class, so it makes sense that you can still use these for dynamic properties. Or to temporarily disable the warning message, you can use an attribute called allow dynamic properties. Do I have an example of that slide? No, I don't actually. So there are ways around it. You can temporarily disable it if your code needs to be well, supporting a wider range of things, or if you really want dynamic properties, you can extend your class from std class. I would say that there are very few situations where this actually makes sense to do, but there are going to be a few. I think it is kind of a useful thing to do this, although there was a large group of people that wasn't keen, because this is how PHP is supposed to work and has done for 27 years, which I don't think can always be used as an argument. I think as a language, we should be really frugal about what kind of functionality we add to the language. But sometimes you just need to add some functionality that really makes it a lot easier for people to not write wrong code, which mistyping properties so they end up being, in this case, protected, public instead of protected, is sort of a important thing, I would say. I would also like this new attribute that PHP 8.2 has is actually kind of funny. Funny is not the word, funky is what I was trying to say. Sometimes you have arguments in functions, passwords, hashes, credit card numbers, although you probably shouldn't be dealing with those yourself. And what you don't want them to do is end up in logs. Backtraces, stack traces from your frameworks, from PHP itself, especially when you have a public project, some e-commerce systems, we're talking about this, where they have administrators, non-technical administrators of these e-commerce sites, posting dumps in forums to ask other people to help them figure out what's wrong. But when it then shows you AWS key in there, that's not great, right? So the feature was proposed to add a sensitive parameter attribute that you can set on arguments, which prevents it from showing up in logs. So if Xdebug is loaded, what you actually get is in your stack trace is that instead of the value secret elephant, you're going to get object sensitive parameter value. If you would call debug get backtrace or debug backtrace, it has all the arguments in there, and the argument would then be wrapped in this object called sensitive parameter value as a class. In debug get backtrace, you can still then unwrap this object by using the value property to still get to it if you really want to do it. But by default, the value of it is never going to show up in a stack trace. If Xdebug is loaded, it doesn't get wrapped into an object because it makes no sense to do, because Xdebug doesn't expose it that way anyway. And creating objects in stack traces a lot with Xdebug was a very costly, very slow to do, so I didn't do that. Instead, I just replace it with a string sensitive parameter, which is good enough in stack traces that you get out of Xdebug. Now, of course, you might be wondering, what happens if I'm debugging this? Can I still see the value? The answer is yes. Let me demonstrate that. It's my last demo. We have sensitive parameters. I copy and pasted that in here earlier today, because yay, copy and paste. How do I name it? Sensitive parameters. Oh, interesting. I thought it all. Okay, this makes perfect sense why I'm getting the error here. Because this is exactly what I was doing, right? If I look at my code, I use a throw, new exception. The reason why it didn't show up in a debugger was because no, I hadn't started the debugger. So let me try that again. Huh. Why does this not? Okay, and of course, also I have not set a breakpoint. Thanks for saying that anyway. I've forgotten about it. Yep. So now it's stopped here at login. So let me step into this, and you'll see that the password is still its original value. Because, of course, when code is running, that value still needs to be there, right? Otherwise, you can't match it against a hash version in your database, for example. So, of course, while running the code, you can still see these things. I think that's a good thing. Debugger should show you the information that is actually there. But it does mean that if you create an Xdebug log while doing this, your password would still be in that log file, unfortunately. Some of PHP's internal functions have also gotten this attribute. Like anything where you would expect that to be the case, anything where you do a password or hash for a password and things like that, will now have had this internal sensitive parameter attribute added, so to make sure that these things will never show up in your log files. I think it's a nice little feature. Does it cover all the cases? No, because it still relies you on actually adding the attribute. But you can now do that yourself. Oh, already done that. Okay, I have no internet. That's fine. I can just explain what the screenshot shows. I like to be up to date with all the features that are being proposed for PHP, and I've started a podcast called PHP Internals News many years ago now. I have to say that the last few months I've had no time for it, so I've not had any episodes. I do want to restart with that soon again, and I think at some point I will have, before the end of the year, an episode about all the new features in PHP 8.2, including the ones that I've missed so far talking with the developers of these features. If you want to stay more up to date than a presentation once in a while, find a podcast. Maybe you find it interesting as well. Any questions? I know, there was quite a lot of new PHP things, some new Xdebug things. Hopefully you learned something. Yeah.
Example with constants that we can use new.
Mm-hmm.
There was a constant that you write new initializers. You write new with the class to the constant. Is it possible in PHP? Something that stuck in my head.
I'm the
New initializer.
yeah.
Not bad. Second one. No.
This one?
Yes. What is the database link? Is it class? Can we do it?
It's a class name, yes.
And can you write? Okay.
Yeah, yeah, you can do this. This works. Hmm? It only works for global constants? Okay, I believe you. I will look at that later. I thought you could do it like this. Could do it like class constants as well. It must be true then if it's in the RC, right? Well, it's a feature request, but I would then probably say that if this wasn't in RFC, it is probably going to have so many side effects or edge cases that it wasn't implemented. Because that's usually the reason why we haven't done it yet. I'm going to have to figure that one out as well. Because I thought you could do this. And of course, when I run this example, because the class doesn't get instantiated, it might not show an error. All right, thanks for that. Anything else? If you have anything else, if you want to talk about what the PHP Foundation does, want more information about that, in case you have a good idea for a pitch of PHP, come and find me. I'll be around the rest of the conference. Once there are beers, I will be having a beer.
In 20 minutes.
20 minutes, yay. So let me go to the last slides. I will be posting these slides on here. I think at some point the recording will also show up somewhere. I'm not sure whether the URL actually works yet. I haven't tried it. But I'll upload them probably tomorrow during the morning. And I'll post a link in Slack if you want to look at them again. And yeah, if that's everything for now, I hope you find this useful, and I'll see you around in the next day and a bit. Thanks very much.